How about help? Oh, okay, now? Awesome, thank you. Good morning. Today is the Feast of All Saints, the Church's celebration of those who have gone before us. We envision our beloved dead and the generations before them as a vast cloud of witnesses. Later in the service, we'll see that cloud represented on the screens around the sanctuary as the names of our departed loved ones, which are in the little pamphlet you've been given, appear and are replaced by others. Members of this congregation have spent several weeks entering those names in a book at the back of the sanctuary or emailing them to the church office. Every year, my personal list gets longer, but most of the people on my list weren't saints in the colloquial sense of the word. They were not models of perfection. My list includes a difficult grandfather I never met because he killed himself before I was born. It includes a brother-in-law, my sister's husband, who once picked me up and shook me during an argument. It includes a host of relatives who struggled with alcoholism. All of these people, despite their very real problems and flaws, also bestowed tremendous gifts upon me and the world. Without my grandfather, neither my father nor I would have been born. My brother-in-law was a tireless advocate for affordable housing and went out of his way to help my parents, even when he didn't like them much. The people I loved who struggled with addiction were funny and smart, creative and caring. One was an attorney who championed civil rights when that was an unpopular cause. Another volunteered on the pediatric ward of a large hospital, and despite not being much of a reader herself, gave me a huge box of books every Christmas. The gifts and virtues I've just described don't negate the difficulties and pain I've also mentioned. The difficulties and pain don't cancel out the gifts and virtues. People, every person, all of us, are complicated mixtures of the good and the challenging. When people form families, those families are even more complicated. Some of the people on my list did seem perfect to me, or as perfect as humanly possible. I suspect that means I didn't know them very well. Today, we honor everyone on my list and everyone on yours as a saint. So what is a saint, anyway? Churches set their own requirements for sainthood. In the Catholic Church, saints must have performed a miracle or been martyred for their faith. The Orthodox Church requires a virtuous life of obvious holiness. The Episcopal Church looks for virtue, self-sacrifice, and witness. But the simplest definition of a saint is a holy one, someone set aside for God's special purposes. That means that we're all saints. The odds against any of us being born have been estimated at 1 in 400 trillion. Exactly the right combination of ancestors from the beginning of human existence to our own parents had to meet and successfully reproduce for any one of us, each as individual and unique as a snowflake, to come into being. That sure sounds to me like being chosen by God. If we don't already feel chosen, baptism makes the matter explicit. The baptismal covenant of the Episcopal Church charges us to seek and serve Christ in all persons and to strive for justice and peace among all people, respecting the dignity of every human being. Baptism calls us to and sets us aside for God's special purposes. So do Jesus' commandments to love your neighbor as yourself and love one another as I have loved you. All of us are saints. All of us are imperfect and complicated. That brings us to today's gospel, the raising of Lazarus. We usually hear this lesson during Lent, the Church's 40 days of preparation for Easter. Jesus' raising of Lazarus is a dress rehearsal for his own resurrection. Jesus knows that he's about to be executed, although his friends refuse to believe him. Having received word that his friend Lazarus is sick and needs healing, Jesus waits until he's sure Lazarus is dead, even though Lazarus' sisters, Martha and Mary, are rightly grief-stricken and horrified. Couldn't Jesus have simply kept his friend from dying in the first place? It's a dramatic story, but I think Jesus' charge to the bystanders after he has performed the miracle may be as important as the miracle itself. Unbind him and let him go. Resurrection requires a welcoming committee, loved ones to remove both physical bindings, the funeral cloths in which Lazarus would have been wrapped, and metaphorical ones. Restoring life means restoring relationship. I've often wondered what it was like for Lazarus to come back to life. As overjoyed as he must have been to see his family and friends again, was returning also a painful shock? When I worked as a hospital chaplain, I met a lot of patients from all faith traditions and none who told me about near-death experiences. These were never described as frightening. They were always filled with love and light, so much so that the reverse journey was often difficult. One patient described climbing back into her body as forcing myself into clothing that no longer fit. Almost all of these patients said they came back or were sent back because they had something to do, usually involving caring for others. My daughter needed me, said the patient whose body felt too tight. She and the others, like all of us, had been set aside for special purposes. Lazarus needed his winding cloths removed. My patients needed to readjust to a world filled with less love and light than the one they visited so briefly. People returning to life in less literal ways, refugees, recovering addicts, former prisoners navigating re-entry, need to be released from the bindings of guilt and judgment, of shame and terror. They need to be freed to fulfill their own special purposes. The most powerful solvent for guilt and judgment, for shame and terror, is love. One of the saints on my list is my mother, who joined AA as a divorced single mom in 1964 when I was 3, and I've told parts of this story before. She was deeply ashamed both of her alcoholism and of being divorced, which in those days was much more stigmatized than it is now. But she had a core of staunch AA friends who loved her back into health and wholeness. They welcomed her at meetings and spent hours with her on the phone and came to our holiday parties. One banker friend lent Mom money when she desperately needed it, interest-free loans she repaid to the penny. My mother returned all this love by loving other new AA members. As her own shackles of shame had been undone, so she worked to loosen the bonds of others. Mom died in 2010. She wasn't Christian or religious at all, but on her deathbed, she kept raising her hand as if to knock at a door. I'm certain that on the other side of that door, she found her parents and grandparents and beloved friends who had gone before her. I am sure they helped loosen whatever bonds she still carried from life, welcoming her into the place where God wipes the tears from all faces. And I am certain that when I go through that door, my mother will be one of the people waiting to help undo my own binding cloths. The raising of Lazarus is Jesus' dress rehearsal for Easter. All Saints is our rehearsal for our own reception into the communion of saints. Someday, our names will be on these screens. As we have raised others, so we shall be raised. How will we, in all our flaws and imperfections, unbind others while we are still here? How will we fulfill our special purposes by embodying the extravagant, life-giving love of Christ? Amen.